Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 8, Rebellious, Maryland. No sooner had the secession ordinance been secretly passed by the Convention of Virginia than Governor Letcher informed Jefferson Davis of the event, and doubtless by preconcert invited him to send a commissioner from Montgomery to Richmond to negotiate an alliance. The adhesion of Virginia was an affair of such magnitude and pressing need to the Cotton States that Davis made the vice president of the new Confederacy, Alexander H. Stephens, his plenipotentiary, who accordingly arrived at Richmond on the 22nd of April. Here he found everything favorable to his mission. The convention was filled with a newborn zeal of insurrection. Many lately stubborn Union members were willingly accepting offices in the extemporized army of the state. The governor had that day appointed Robert E. Lee to the command-in-chief of the Virginia forces, military and naval, which choice the convention immediately confirmed. Stephens was shrewd enough to perceive that his real negotiation lay neither with the governor nor the convention, but with this newly created chieftain. That very evening he invited Lee to a conference, at which the late Federal colonel forgot the sentiment written by his own hand 2 days before, that he never again desired to draw his sword except in defense of his native state, and now expressed great eagerness for the proposed alliance. Lee being willing, the remainder of the negotiation was easy, and 2 days afterwards, April 24, Stephens and certain members of the convention signed a formal military league, making Virginia an immediate member of the Confederate States and placing her armies under the command of Jefferson Davis, thus treating with contempt the convention proviso that the secession ordinance should only take effect after ratification by the people, the vote on which had been set for the 4th Thursday of May. Lee and others endured without protest this military usurpation, under which they became beneficiaries. No excuse for it could be urged. Up to this time, not the slightest sign of hostility to Virginia had been made by the Lincoln administration. No threats, no invasion, no blockade. The burning of Harper's Ferry and Gosport were induced by the hostile action of Virginia herself. On the contrary, even after those acts, Mr. Lincoln repeated in a letter to Reverdy Johnson, which will be presently quoted, the declarations made to the Virginia commissioners on the 13th, that he intended no war, no invasion, no subjugation, nothing but defense of the government. At the time of the Baltimore riot, the telegraph was still undisturbed, and by its help, as well as by personal information and private letters, that startling occurrence and the succeeding insurrectionary uprising were speedily made known throughout the entire South, where they excited the liveliest satisfaction and most sanguine hopes. Southern newspapers became clamorous for an advance on Washington. Some of the most pronounced Richmond conspirators had all along been favorable to such an enterprise, and extravagant estimates of possibilities were telegraphed to Montgomery. They set forth that Baltimore was in arms, Maryland rising, Lincoln in a trap, and not more than 1,200 regulars and 3,000 volunteers in Washington, that the rebels had 3,000 men at Harper's Ferry, that Governor Letcher had seized 3 to 5 steamers on the James River, that the connecting Southern railroads could carry 5,000 to 7,000 men daily at the rate of 350 miles per day. As a leader, we want Davis. An hour now is worth years of common fighting. One dash, and Lincoln is taken, the country saved, and the leader who does it will be immortalized. This, from a railroad superintendent supposed to have practical skill in transportation, looked plausible. The Montgomery cabinet caught the enthusiasm of the moment, and on April 22 Jefferson Davis telegraphed to Governor Letcher at Richmond, "In addition to the forces heretofore ordered, requisitions have been made for 13 regiments, 8 to rendezvous at Lynchburg, 4 at Richmond, and 1 at Harper's Ferry. Sustain Baltimore if practicable. We reinforce you." This dispatch shows us what a farce even the Virginia Military League was, since 2 days before its conclusion foreign rebel troops were already ordered to the sacred soil of the Old Dominion. Governor Letcher was doubtless willing enough to respond to the suggestion of Davis, but apparently had neither the necessary troops nor preparation. He had as yet been able to muster but a shadowy force on the line of the Potomac, notwithstanding his adjutant general's pretentious report of the previous December. Nevertheless, hoping that events might ripen the opportunity into better conditions for success, he lost no time in sending such encouragement and help as were at his control. The rebel commander at Harper's Ferry had communicated with the Baltimore authorities and effected a cordial understanding with them, and they promised to warn him of hostile menace or approach. Senator James M. Mason thereupon was dispatched to Baltimore. He seems to have agreed to supply the Maryland rebels with such arms as Virginia could spare, and some 2,000 muskets actually found their way to Baltimore from this source during the following week, though an arrangement to send 20 cannon 32-pounders to the same city from the Gosport Navy Yard apparently failed. But it would appear that the project of a dash at Washington found unexpected opposition in the councils of Virginia's new military chief, Robert E. Lee, who assumed command of the state forces April 23. He instructed the officers at Alexandria and along the Potomac to act on the defensive, to establish camps of instruction and collect men and provisions. This course was little to the liking of some of the more ardent rebels. They telegraphed in substance that Davis's immediate presence at Richmond was essential, that his non-arrival was causing dissatisfaction, that the troops had no confidence in Lee, and were murmuring that there were signs of temporizing, hopes of a settlement without collision, and consequent danger of demoralization, that Lee dwelt on enthusiasm North and against aggression from us. Said another dispatch, "Have conversed with General Robert E. Lee. He wishes to repress enthusiasm of our people. His troops not ready, although pouring in every hour. They remain here. General Kock has 300 and no more corps of observation on Potomac near Alexandria. He considers Maryland helpless, needing encouragement and succor. Believes 20,000 men in and near Washington." In no state were the secession plottings more determined and continuous than in Maryland. From the first, a small but able and unwearying knot of Baltimore conspirators sought to commit her people to rebellion by the empty form of a secession ordinance. They made speeches, held conventions, besieged the governor with committees. They joined the Washington conspirators in treasonable caucus. They sent recruits to Charleston. They incited the Baltimore riot, and there is no doubt that in these doings they reflected a strong minority sentiment in the State. With such a man as Pickens or Letcher in the executive chair, they might have succeeded, but in Governor Hicks they found a constant stumbling block and an irremovable obstacle. He gave Southern commissioners the cold shoulder. He refused at first to call the legislature. He declined to order a vote on holding a convention. He informed General Scott of the rebel plots of Maryland, and testified of treasonable designs before the investigating committee of Congress. His enemies have accused him of treachery, and cite in proof a letter which they allege he wrote a few days after Lincoln's election, in which he inquired whether a certain militia company would be good men to send out to kill Lincoln and his men. If the letter be not a forgery, it was at most an ill-judged and awkward piece of badinage, for his repeated declarations and acts leave no doubt that from first to last his heart was true to the Union. He had the serious fault of timidity, and in several instances foolishly gave way to popular clamor, but in every case he soon resumed his hostility to secession. The Baltimore ride, as we have seen, put a stop to the governor's arrangements to raise and arm 4 regiments of Maryland volunteers, of picked Union men, for United States service within the State or at Washington. Instead of this, he, in the flurry of the uprising, called out the existing militia companies, mainly disloyal in sentiment and officered by secessionists. The Baltimore authorities collected arms, bought munitions, and organized companies to resist the passage of troops. They forbade the export of provisions, regulated the departure of vessels, controlled the telegraph. General Stewart, commanding the state militia, established posts and patrols, and in effect Maryland became hostile territory to the North and to the government. For 3 or 4 days treason was rampant. All Union men were intimidated. All Union expression or manifestation was suppressed by mob violence. The hitherto fearless Union newspapers, in order to save their offices and material from destruction, were compelled to drift with the flood and to print editorials advising in vague terms that all must now unite in the defense of Maryland. It was in this storm and stress of insurrection that Governor Hicks protested against Butler's Landing and sent Lincoln his proposal of mediation, and on the same day, April 22, and by the same influence, he was prevailed upon to summon the legislature to meet on the 26th. It so happened that the seats of the Baltimore members were vacant. A special election, dominated by the same passions, was held on the 24th. Only a states' rights ticket was voted for, and of the 30,000 electors in the city, 9,244, without opposition, elected the little clique of secession conspirators, the Union men not daring to nominate candidates or come to the polls. For the moment, the leading Unionists of Maryland deemed their true role one of patience and conciliation. In this spirit, Reverdy Johnson, a lawyer and statesman of fame and influence, both at home and abroad, came to Lincoln upon the stereotyped errand to obtain some assurance in writing that he meditated no invasion or subjugation of the South, to which the President confidentially replied, "I forbore to answer yours of the 22nd because of my aversion, which I thought you understood, to getting on paper and furnishing new grounds for misunderstanding. I do say the sole purpose of bringing troops here is to defend this capital. I do say I have no purpose to invade Virginia with them or any other troops, as I understand the word invasion. But suppose Virginia sends her troops or admits others through her borders to assail this capital, am I not to repel them even to the crossing of the Potomac, if I can? Suppose Virginia erects or permits to be erected batteries on the opposite shore to bombard the city, are we to stand still and see it done? In a word, if Virginia strikes us, are we not to strike back? and as effectively as we can. Again, are we not to hold Fort Monroe, for instance, if we can? I have no objection to declare 1,000 times that I have no purpose to invade Virginia or any other state, but I do not mean to let them invade us without striking back. Mr. Johnson replied, thanking the President for his frankness and endorsing all his policy. In a word, he said, all that your note suggests would be my purpose were I entrusted with your high office. He also promised that the President's note should be held perfectly confidential, but it appears that Mr. Johnson chose his confidants with very poor judgment, for within 4 days its substance was written from Washington direct to Jefferson Davis. By no means the least of the difficult problems before Mr. Lincoln and his Cabinet was the question how to deal with the Maryland legislature so unexpectedly called to assemble. The special election in Baltimore, held under secession terrorism, had resulted in the unopposed choice of 10 delegates from the city, all believed to be disloyal, and several of them known to be conspicuous secessionists. With this fresh element of treason suddenly added to a legislative body so small in numbers, it seemed morally certain that its first act would be to arm the State and pass something equivalent to a secession ordinance. Should this be permitted, how could it best be prevented? Ought the legislature to be arrested? Should it be dispersed by force? General Butler was at Annapolis, where it was expected that the session would be held, and he signified more than willingness to act in the matter. The plans were discussed in Cabinet with great contrariety of opinion. Some of the least belligerent of the President's counselors were by this time in hot blood over the repeated disasters and indignities which the government had suffered, and began to indulge in the unreasoning temper and impatience of the irritated public opinion of the North, where one of the largest and most influential journals had intimated that the country needed a dictator. Mr. Bates filed a written opinion, in spirit a protest, declaring that the treasonable acts in Virginia and Maryland were encouraged by the fact that we frighten nobody, we hurt nobody, though he failed to suggest any other than merely vindictive remedies that were immediately feasible. Mr. Chase also partook of this frame of mind, and wrote the President a curt note of querulous complaint, eminently prophetic of his future feelings and attitude toward Mr. Lincoln. Let me beg you to remember that the disunionists have anticipated us in everything, and that as yet we have accomplished nothing but the destruction of our own property. Let me beg you to remember also that it has been a darling object with the disunionists to secure the passage of a secession ordinance by Maryland. The passage of that ordinance will be the signal for the entry of disunion forces into Maryland. It will give a color of law and regularity to rebellion, and thereby triple its strength. The Custom House in Baltimore will be seized, and Fort McHenry attacked, perhaps taken. What next? Do not, I pray you, let this new success of treason be inaugurated in the presence of American troops. Save us from this new humiliation. A word to the brave old commanding general will do the work of prevention. You alone can give the word. The bad taste and injustice of such language consisted in its assumption that the President was somehow culpable for what had already occurred. Whereas Mr. Chase had in the beginning been more conciliatory towards the rebels than had Mr. Lincoln. With a higher conception of the functions of the presidential office, Mr. Lincoln treated public clamor and the fretfulness of cabinet ministers alike with quiet toleration. Again, as before, and as ever afterward, he listened attentively to such advice as his cabinet had to give, but reserved the decision to himself. He looked over the Attorney General's legal notes, weighed the points of political expediency, canvassed carefully the probabilities of military advantage, and embodied his final directions in a letter to General Scott. My dear sir, The Maryland legislature assembles tomorrow at Annapolis, and not improbably will take action to arm the people of that State against the United States. The question has been submitted to and considered by me whether it would not be justifiable, upon the ground of necessary defense, for you, as General in Chief of the United States Army, to arrest or disperse the members of that body. I think it would not be justifiable nor efficient for the desired object. First, they have a clearly legal right to assemble, and we cannot know in advance that their action will not be lawful and peaceful. And if we wait until they shall have acted, their arrest or dispersion will not lessen the effect of their action. Secondly, we cannot permanently prevent their action. If we arrest them, we cannot long hold them as prisoners, and when liberated, they will immediately reassemble and take their action. And precisely the same if we simply disperse them, they will immediately reassemble in some other place. I therefore conclude that it is only left to the commanding general to watch and await their action, which, if it shall be to arm their people against the United States, he is to adopt the most prompt and efficient means to counteract, even if necessary to the bombardment of their cities, and in the extremest necessity the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Thus directed, General Scott wrote to General Butler on the following day: "In the absence of the undersigned, the foregoing instructions are turned over to Brigadier General B. F. Butler of the Massachusetts Volunteers, or other officer commanding at Annapolis, who will carry them out in a right spirit, that is, with moderation and firmness. In the case of arrested individuals notorious for their hostility to the United States, the prisoners will be safely kept and duly cared for, but not surrendered except on the order of the commander aforesaid." At the last moment, however, conscious of the offenses against the Government which some of their members were meditating, the Maryland legislature induced the governor to convene their special session at the town of Frederick. Here Governor Hicks sent them his special message on the 27th, reciting the recent occurrences, transmitting his correspondence with the various Federal authorities, and expressing the conviction that the only safety of Maryland lies in preserving a neutral position between our brethren of the North and of the South. At the same time, he admitted the right of transit for Federal troops, and counseled that we shall array ourselves for union and peace. The lack of coherence and consistency in the message was atoned for by its underlying spirit of loyalty. Meanwhile, the plentiful arrival of volunteers enabled the Government to strengthen its hold upon Annapolis and the railroad. The military department of Annapolis was created, and General Butler assigned to its command. This embraced 20 miles on each side of the railroad from Annapolis to Washington, and all of Maryland not included in these limits was left in General Patterson's Department of Pennsylvania. Measures were taken to concentrate sufficient troops at Harrisburg and at Philadelphia to approach Baltimore in force from those quarters and permanently to occupy the city, and to give the military ample authority for every contingency. The President issued the following additional order to General Scott: "You are engaged in suppressing an insurrection against the laws of the United States. If at any point on or in the vicinity of any military line which is now or which shall be used between the city of Philadelphia and the city of Washington, you find resistance which renders it necessary to suspend the writ of habeas corpus for the public safety, you personally, or through the officer in command at the point at which resistance occurs, are authorized to suspend that writ." Having run its course about a week or 10 days, the secession frenzy of Baltimore subsided. The railroad managers of that city once more tendered their services to the War Department, but Secretary Cameron, instead of giving them immediate encouragement, ordered that the Annapolis route be opened for public travel and traffic. Their isolation, first created by the bridge burning, was thus continued, and soon began to tell seriously upon their business interests, as well as upon the general industries and comfort of the city. On the 4th of May, General Butler, under Scott's orders, moved forward and took post with 2 regiments at the Relay House, 8 miles from Baltimore, where he could control the westward trains and cut off communication with Harper's Ferry. The significance of all these circumstances did not escape the popular observation. The Union newspapers took courage and printed bold leaders. The city government dismissed the rebel militia and permitted bridges and telegraphs to be repaired. Governor Hicks issued a proclamation for the election of representatives in Congress to attend the coming special session on the 4th of July, and also by special message to the legislature and publication in the newspapers, repudiated the charge that he had consented to the bridge burning. The Unionists of both city and State, gaining confidence with the strong evidences of reaction, began to hold meetings and conventions vigorously to denounce secession and to demonstrate that they were in a decided majority. The manifest and sweeping change in popular feeling produced due effect upon the legislature. The first movements of that body were somewhat contradictory. Both branches declared that they did not possess the requisite authority to commit the State to secession, but they legalized the insurrectionary act of Baltimore and gave the city authorities unlimited discretion to raise and appropriate moneys for defense. Secret deliberations of the Senate soon developed the disloyalty of that branch, and a bill placing the military control of the State in the hands of a secession board of public safety was passed to a second reading by 14 to 8. This measure, as its scope and purpose became known, met such fierce opposition both in and out of the legislature, and concentrated the Union sentiment to such a degree that its authors felt themselves compelled to abandon it. It was shaded off into a project for a convention, and this again, under the popular protest and reaction, dwindled away into spiteful reports and strings of resolutions in both branches remonstrating against the military occupation of Maryland, against the prosecution of the war, and urging the government to recognize the independence of the South. It is said that Senator Mason of Virginia appeared before the legislature as a commissioner to negotiate a military alliance. If so, he found public opinion too strong and the Union armies too near to consummate the scheme, whatever encouragement he may have received from a minority of the members. The question of attempted secession was for the moment set at rest by sending a committee of 3 to President Lincoln. They were respectfully received May 4, and assured by him that he would act in no revengeful spirit. But he, together with Seward and Cameron, gave the committee to understand that they were well informed of the treasonable spirit which animated a considerable minority of the legislature, and that the government was not only firm in its purpose, but also now had ample force at hand to sustain the Unionists of Maryland and maintain the military approaches to the capital. The committee returned to Frederick and reported the result of their mission, stating that they felt painfully confident that a war is to be waged to reduce all the seceding States to allegiance to the United States government, and that the whole military power of the Federal government will be exerted to accomplish that purpose. While in a previous portion of their report they had already declared that they did not feel themselves authorized to enter into any engagements or arrangements with the Federal government to induce it to change its relations to the State of Maryland, considering it proper under the circumstances to leave the entire discretion and responsibility of the existing state of things to that government. Little by little, loyalty and authority asserted themselves. About the 1st of May, General Scott began preparing to reestablish the transit of troops through Baltimore, and on the 9th, the first detachment since the riot of April 19 successfully made the journey. Some 1,300 men in all, including Sherman's regular battery from Minnesota and 500 regulars from Texas, were brought in transports from Perryville and landed at Locust Point under the guns of the Harriet Lane, embarked in cars, and carried through South Baltimore. The city authorities, police, and a large concourse of people were present, and the precautions and arrangements were so thorough that not the slightest disturbance occurred. 4 days after this, May 13, the railroad brought the first train from Philadelphia over its repaired track and restored bridges. The Maryland legislature, finding its occupation gone, and yet nursing an obstinate secession sympathy, adjourned on May 14 to meet again on the 4th of June. About the same time, the people of Baltimore received a surprise. Late on the evening of May 13, under cover of an opportune thunderstorm, General Butler moved from the Relay House into the city with about 1,000 men, the bulk of his force being the famous 6th Massachusetts, which had been mobbed there on the 19th of April. The movement was entirely unauthorized and called forth a severe rebuke from General Scott, but it met no resistance and was loudly applauded by the impatient public opinion of the North, which could ill comprehend the serious military risk it involved. The general carried his spirit of bravado still further. He made his camp on Federal Hill, which he proceeded to fortify, and on the afternoon of the 14th sent a detachment of only 35 men to seize a lot of arms stored near the locality of the riot. The little squad of volunteers found the warehouse and were given possession of the arms: 2,200 muskets sent from Virginia and 4,020 pikes of the John Brown pattern made for the city by the Winans establishment during the riot week, and loading them on 35 wagons and drays, started for Fort McHenry over some of the identical streets where the Massachusetts soldiers had been murdered by the mob. It was late when this long procession got under way. Large crowds collected, and riotous demonstrations of a threatening character were made at several points. Fortunately, the police gave efficient assistance, and unnecessary sacrifice of life was averted. Coincident with this, the Union cause gained another signal advantage in Maryland. Governor Hicks's courage had risen with the ebb of disloyalty throughout the State, and as soon as the legislature was adjourned, he issued his proclamation calling into the service of the United States the 4 regiments he originally promised under the President's requisition. These were rapidly formed and became a part of the Union Army under a new call. Amidst such fluctuations, the more belligerent Maryland rebels also formed companies and went south, some to Richmond, some to the rebel camp at Harper's Ferry. But the fraction of military aid which Maryland gave to the rebellion rose to no special significance. Out of these transactions, however, there arose a noteworthy judicial incident. A man named John Merryman, found recruiting as a lieutenant for one of these rebel companies, was arrested May 25 and imprisoned in Fort McHenry. Chief Justice Taney, then in Baltimore, being applied to, issued a writ of habeas corpus to bring the prisoner before him. General George Cadwalader, at this time in command, made a respectful reply to the writ, alleging Merryman's treason, and stating further that the President had authorized him to suspend the writ in such cases, and requested the Chief Justice to postpone further action till the matter could be referred to the President. The Chief Justice immediately ordered an attachment to issue against General Cadwalader for contempt, upon which the marshal made return that he was unable to serve it, being denied entrance to Fort McHenry. Thereupon the Chief Justice admitted the existence of a superior military force, but declared that the President, under the Constitution of the United States, cannot suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, nor authorize a military officer to do it, and that Merryman ought therefore to be immediately discharged, and went on to say that he should cause his opinion, when filed, and all the proceedings to be laid before the President, in order that he might perform his constitutional duty to enforce the laws by securing obedience to the process of the United States. To this general purport the Chief Justice filed his written opinion on the 1st of June, and caused a copy to be transmitted to the President. Of that opinion it will not be irrelevant to quote the criticism of one of the profoundest and most impartial jurists of that day. Chief Justice Taney's opinion in Merryman's case is not an authority. This, of course, is said in the judicial sense, but it is not even an argument in the full sense. He does not argue the question from the language of the clause, nor from the history of the clause, nor from the principles of the Constitution, except by an elaborate depreciation of the President's office, even to the extent of making him, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, called from the United States into the service of the United States, no more than an assistant to the Marshal's posse, the deepest plunge of judicial rhetoric. The opinion, moreover, has a tone, not to say a ring, of disaffection to the President and to the northern and western side of his House, which is not comfortable to suppose in the person who fills the central seat of impersonal justice. To this estimate of the spirit of Chief Justice Taney's view we may properly add President Lincoln's own official answer to its substance. No attention was, of course, paid to the transmitted papers, but the President, at the time of their receipt, was engaged in preparing his message to the coming special session of Congress, and in that document he presented the justification of his act. The original draft of the message in Lincoln's autograph manuscript thus defines the executive authority with that force of statement and strength of phraseology of which he was so consummate a master. Soon after the first call for militia, I felt it my duty to authorize the commanding general, in proper cases, according to his discretion, to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, or, in other words, to arrest and detain, without resort to the ordinary processes and forms of law, such individuals as he might deem dangerous to the public safety. At my verbal request, as well as by the general's own inclination, this authority has been exercised, but very sparingly. Nevertheless, the legality and propriety of what has been done under it are questioned, and I have been reminded from a high quarter that one who is sworn to take care that the laws be faithfully executed should not himself be one to violate them. Of course, I gave some consideration to the questions of power and propriety before I acted in this matter. The whole of the laws which I was sworn to take care that they be faithfully executed were being resisted, and failing to be executed in nearly one-third of the States. Must I have allowed them to finally fail of execution, even had it been perfectly clear that by the use of the means necessary to their execution some single law made in such extreme tenderness of the citizen's liberty that practically it relieves more of the guilty than the innocent should, to a very limited extent, be violated? To state the question more directly, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? Even in such a case, I should consider my official oath broken, if I should allow the government to be overthrown, when I might think the disregarding the single law would tend to preserve it. But in this case I was not, in my own judgment, driven to this ground. In my opinion, I violated no law. The provision of the Constitution that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it is equivalent to a provision, that such privilege may be suspended when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety does require it. I decided that we have a case of rebellion, and that the public safety does require the qualified suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, which I authorized to be made. Now it is insisted that Congress, and not the Executive, is vested with this power. But the Constitution itself is silent as to which or who is to exercise the power. And as the provision plainly was made for a dangerous emergency, I cannot bring myself to believe that the framers of that instrument intended that in every case the danger should run its course until Congress could be called together, the very assembling of which might be prevented, as was intended in this case, by the rebellion. The alterations and corrections from this first draft into the more impersonal form as finally sent to Congress and officially printed, but nowise changing its argument or substance, are also entirely in Lincoln's handwriting. That second and corrected form better befits the measured solemnity of a state paper. But in the language quoted above, we seem brought into direct contact with the living workings of Lincoln's mind, and in this light the autograph original possesses a peculiar biographical interest and value. End of Chapter 8.